The small town of Maplewood was quiet, peaceful, but for Cynthia, it often felt lonely. She was a single mother, working long hours at a local diner barely, making enough to keep food on the table for her 8-year-old son, William. Life wasn't easy, but no matter how exhausted she was, Cynthia never let her struggles show. One evening, as she tucked William into bed, his innocent eyes looked up at her. "Mom, why do you always smile, even when you're tired?" he asked softly. Cynthia gently brushed his hair back, her heart aching but full of love. "Because no matter how hard things get, there's always something to be thankful for," she whispered. William didn't fully understand it at that moment, but those words would stay with him forever. The next morning, William sat at their small kitchen table, nibbling on a piece of plain toast. Their apartment was small, the kitchen barely big enough for the two of them, but Cynthia always made it feel like home. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, William noticed something. His mother's hands were shaking. He knew why. She hadn't eaten. Without hesitation, he looked up at her and said, "Mom, you should have my toast." Cynthia smiled warmly, shaking her head. "I already ate, sweetheart." But William knew she was lying. He wanted to say something, but instead, he took a deep breath and whispered, "I'm thankful for this toast. And for you?" Cynthia felt a lump in her throat. She had spent years teaching William about gratitude, but in that moment, she realized he was truly learning. Weeks passed, and then one night, a terrible storm hit Maplewood. The wind howled, shaking the walls of their small apartment. Rain poured in through the cracks in the ceiling, dripping onto the floor. Cynthia wrapped William in a blanket, holding him close as thunder roared outside. William clung to her, his voice shaky. "Are we going to be okay?" Cynthia squeezed him tighter, whispering, "Of course we are. We have each other, and that's all that matters." But deep inside, she was scared. Their savings were gone. If the storm damaged their home any further, they might have nowhere to go. As the rain pounded against the windows, William closed his eyes and whispered something Cynthia had taught him. "Thank you for keeping us safe." Cynthia held him closer, tears forming in her eyes. Little did they know, this storm would be the beginning of a journey that would change their lives forever. The storm had passed, but the damage was done. Their tiny apartment was now leaking in several places. Walls were damp, the ceiling had water stains, and the landlord? He wasn't willing to pay for repairs. Cynthia knew she couldn't afford to fix it herself. The next morning, as she walked William to school, she forced a smile. "Don't worry about home, sweetheart. Things always have a way of working out." William nodded, trusting his mother's words. But deep inside, Cynthia was terrified. She needed a miracle. That afternoon, as she worked at the diner, something caught her attention. Two customers at a nearby table were talking about a new bakery opening in town, and they were looking for staff. Cynthia's heart raced. She knew she had to try. The next morning, Cynthia stood outside the bakery, her hands clutching her worn-out purse. She took a deep breath, then stepped inside. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Holloway, the bakery owner, an elderly woman with sharp eyes but a kind face. "Do you have experience?" she asked, her voice calm but inquisitive. Cynthia stood tall. "I've worked in a diner for years and I can learn anything." Mrs. Holloway studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You start tomorrow. Don't be late." Cynthia almost cried with relief. This job wasn't just about money, it was a chance to rebuild their lives. That night, she hugged William tightly. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. For the first time in a long time, she truly believed it. Days turned into weeks. Cynthia worked tirelessly at the bakery, kneading dough, taking orders and learning everything she could. The job wasn't easy, but she was grateful for every moment. Meanwhile, at school, William noticed something. A new boy, Adam, always sat alone. His clothes were old, his lunchbox almost always empty. William recognized that kind of struggle, had lived it himself. One afternoon during lunch, William looked at his sandwich, then at Adam. Without hesitation, he split it in half and held it out. "Here, you can have this." Adam hesitated, his eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you." At that moment, William understood something. Gratitude wasn't just about words, it was about actions. What he didn't know was that this small act of kindness would lead to something much bigger. A few days later, something unexpected happened. As school ended, a middle-aged man in a construction uniform arrived to pick up Adam's father, Mr. Reynolds. He had heard about William's kindness and wanted to meet the boy who had helped his son. That's when he saw Cynthia arrive to pick up William. He walked over, smiling. "Your son is a wonderful boy," he said warmly. "He helped Adam when no one else did." Cynthia smiled proudly, brushing William's hair. "I just try to teach him that kindness always comes back to you." Mr. Reynolds nodded. "Actually," he said thoughtfully, "I own a small construction company, and we're looking for catering services for our workers. Would your bakery be interested?" Cynthia's eyes widened. If she could get the bakery this deal, it would mean more job security and possibly a raise. "I'll speak to my boss," she said, her voice filled with hope. That night, as Cynthia tucked William into bed, she whispered, "See? Kindness has a way of making miracles happen." The next morning, Cynthia took a deep breath and walked into the bakery. She nervously approached Mrs. Holloway. "I have a business proposal," she started, her voice trembling slightly. She explained the catering opportunity with Mr. Reynolds' company, how they needed fresh meals for their workers. Mrs. Holloway thought for a moment, then smiled. "That's a brilliant idea, Cynthia. Let's do it." Cynthia couldn't believe it. Not only did this deal secure more income for the bakery, but Mrs. Holloway also gave Cynthia a promotion. She would now be responsible for handling special orders and catering requests. That evening, Cynthia and William sat at their small kitchen table, eating a meal they didn't have to worry about affording. For the first time in a long time, Cynthia felt secure. She smiled at William. "I told you, sweetheart, things always work out." William nodded, smiling back. He knew now his mother's words were true. Months passed, and Cynthia's life started to change. With her steady job and extra earnings, she saved every penny she could. Then, one day, she had a surprise for William. As he came out of school, she held his hand and said, "Come with me." They walked through town until they stopped in front of a small, cozy apartment. William looked at it, confused. "It's nice," he said. Cynthia took a deep breath, her eyes shining. "It's ours. I signed the lease today." William's eyes filled with tears. "Really? We don't have to worry about leaking roofs anymore?" Cynthia knelt down, pulling him into a tight hug. "No, sweetheart. We finally have a place to call home." For the first time in years, Cynthia felt like she could breathe. Years passed, and William had grown into a hard-working young man. He carried his mother's lessons of gratitude and kindness with him, no matter where life took him. Now in college on a scholarship, he visited home whenever he could. One evening, as he sat with Cynthia in their cozy apartment, he reached for her hand. "Mom, do you remember when you told me to always be thankful?" Cynthia nodded, a gentle smile on her face. William took a deep breath. "I finally understand. Gratitude isn't just about being thankful for what you have. It's about believing that, no matter how hard life gets, better days will come." Cynthia's heart swelled with pride. "You've learned the most important lesson, my son." As they sat together in the home they had fought so hard for, they knew one thing for sure. No matter what life brought their way, they would always have something to be thankful for.